It was night, and not long after, the knights of the Imperial Guard arrived at the entrance of the cave, and upon seeing what had happened, their eyes widened in surprise and confusion. The entrance of the cave was filled with knights, and on the ground there was a mountain of gnoll corpses. The knights were in shock to see that someone had killed so many gnolls. Vikir, who wore a hood, began to observe them with a serene gaze in silence. The expedition to subdue the gnoll village concluded with the arrival of the Imperial Guard. When they arrived, Miss Yorubaros had disappeared, leaving behind a great amount of riches. With the help of carts, the knights began to fill bags with gold coins to take them out of the cave. In the middle of the night, they loaded all the coins into their carriages and prepared to leave. That was how all the loot was confiscated by the Imperial Guard. It was already daytime, and Pin had his face full of bandages, but his eyes were shining with joy and there was a smile on his face. Not long after, Vikir, who was holding 2 bags full of gold coins, appeared, and with a cheerful gaze mentioned that this was the money he had obtained after selling the loot, and receiving the substantial reward for the expedition to annihilate the gnolls. The eyes of Pin, who was lying in bed with his body full of bandages, began to shine peacefully, and he started to ponder in silence. Vikir began to gaze toward Pin, and with a smile mentioned that the heat from the fire and the smoke had damaged the leather, but he had sold the bones, teeth, and claws for a large sum of money. Upon hearing this, Pin came out of his thoughts and his attention fixed on Vikir, making a smile appear on his face. Vikir sat in the chair and with a worried expression asked about his wounds. Pin interlaced his hands, turned towards our boy, and with a sincere gaze revealed that every joint hurt. But the doctors had said that once he recovered, he was not going to have problems living a normal life. Upon hearing this, Vikir realized why Pin had reached the rank of graduator. Vikir handed a bag of gold coins to Pin, which fell into his lap. This was a gift. Pin opened the bag and saw that it was full of shiny gold coins. His eyes widened in surprise and his jaw dropped. He had never seen so much money before. Vikir had included a good sum as payment for Pin's help during the expedition and to cover medical expenses, since he knew that in his current state, he was not going to be able to work for some time. Pin began to gaze at the ground, not knowing what to say. While sunlight was entering the room through the window, he clenched his fist and asked if now Vikir was going back to the academy. With a calm expression, Vikir nodded. Pin didn't even lift his head to look Vikir in the eyes. He was happy to have been able to be, even if just for a moment, next to the hero of Baskerville. Vikir's attention fixed on him and his eyes began to shine with curiosity and confusion. Our boy remembered that Pin knew a lot about monster ecology, and upon hearing this, Pin's eyes widened in surprise, making his jaw drop in shock. He extended his hands and with a proud smile revealed that in his youth he had traveled across the entire continent, so he could perfectly distinguish the habits of monsters, the location of their nests, as well as subspecies, variants, subtypes, and superior species. With a lost gaze, Vikir got up from the chair, turned his back to Pin and began to walk away. Upon noticing this, Pin's attention fixed on our boy and his eyes filled with when Vikir asked him to wait here. Pin's eyes filled with tears of joy. Vikir turned his head and with a joyful gaze made it clear that he was going to need his help again. Pin began to gaze at Vikir in silence, not knowing what to say. At the same time, at the academy, Professor Venci Morgi was in his office working. His desk was full of mountains of papers. He was somewhat furious since he knew that he would have to do all the work of the academy by himself. While he was distracted, someone started knocking on his office door. Venci Morg came out of his trance, lifted his head and gave them permission to enter. It was Dollars, who was holding several petitions. With a confused gaze, Venci Morgi asked why she had come. Dollars' eyes began to shine with seriousness, and she revealed that she had come to talk about the classmates who needed help with scholarships. She approached Venci Morg's desk and began to show him the petitions. With a curious gaze, the professor began to read carefully, and Dollars explained that these were the petitions of students who, due to family problems, would not be able to continue next semester. The petitions included data from those who could not maintain good grades because they worked part-time and from those who avoided working in order to obtain the scholarship. She began to stare at the teacher with a serious gaze and made it clear that among the students who had received the scholarship, there were some who needed a re-evaluation. She also mentioned that there was a considerable number of students who, although they came from wealthy families, forged their documents to appear as if they were from poor households and thus obtained scholarships fraudulently. It was necessary to recover those scholarships and redistribute them among the students who really needed them. Venti Morgi began to stare at her and his eyes widened with rage. Little by little he was losing patience, pointing at dollars with his finger. He made it clear that the scholarships were granted according to school regulations. As president of the student council, she was the one who had to respect and enforce those rules. With a furious gaze, she placed her hand on the table and asked the professor to review again the disadvantaged students that the regulations might be overlooking. Venti Morgi was furious to see that she was saying he had to do the work twice, with eyes shining with determination. Dollars made it clear that as president of the student council, she had the obligation to raise her voice for the difficulties of the students. With an angry expression, Venti Morg questioned who was going to take responsibility for the burden involved in him having to do the work twice, knowing that she was not someone who would double his salary. Little by little, Dollars also began to lose patience. Her eyes began to shine with contempt upon seeing that Venti Morgi was upset because he had to do the work twice. Placing her hands on the table, she began to stare intently at Venti Morg and made it clear that this was a matter affecting the future of the students. The tension in the room began to rise, and just then, our boy opened the office door. The attention of Venti Morg and Dollars focused on Vikier, and their eyes widened with curiosity. They didn't know what he was doing there. Our boy, who was holding a bag full of gold coins, began to show a serene gaze. Seeing that he had entered the professor's office without even knocking on the door, Venti Morgi mocked him by asking if his parents hadn't taught him manners at home. Upon hearing this, Vikier began to remember his father and the manners he had taught him, and with a smile, Hugo said that the family motto was to respect the strong. Vikier began to gaze toward the ground in silence, making Dollars feel somewhat confused. Venti Morg began to touch his face, closed his eyes and asked why Vikier had come, not knowing if he too had come to complain about not having received a scholarship. With a confused gaze, Vikier began to walk toward his table. Dollars' attention was fixed on our boy, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat curious. Vikier left the bag of coins on top of Venti Morgi's table. The professor's attention was fixed on the bag and his mind filled with curiosity. Our boy opened the bag, revealing the shiny gold coins. With a sincere gaze, he began to observe the professor and revealed that he had come to pay his tuition. Upon seeing the shiny gold coins, Venti Morgi's eyes widened in surprise. With a suspicious gaze, he asked where Vikier had gotten so much money. Our boy adjusted his glasses and mentioned that he had participated in the expedition against the gnolls. By chance, the fire he had lit while resting fell on the gnoll cave, and the swarm was completely annihilated. Venti Morg placed his hands on top of the table and began to stand up. According to him, this made no sense. With a calm gaze, Vikier said that Venti Morgi could ask Minnie Pin, the guide who had accompanied him, and also questioned whether with this amount of money he would be able to pay for next semester's tuition. Venti Morg began to observe the gold coins carefully and his eyes expanded with curiosity. He picked up several gold coins and left them on top of the table, mentioning that this was more than enough. Vikier could pay full tuition for all 4 years at once in a single payment. Vikier began to gaze at the ground, and said that the rest of the money was also to pay for tuition. Dollars' attention was fixed on our boy and she couldn't help but sweat. With a serious gaze, Venti Morgi made it clear that the amount of leftover money was too much just to pay for tuition. He didn't know if our boy was thinking about buying a building. According to him, Vikier was aiming for a professorship, not a student position. With a calm expression, Vikier asked Venti Morg to use the rest of the money for students who had not been able to pay their tuition. Upon hearing this, Dollars' eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe it. With a confused gaze, Venti Morgi questioned whether Vikier really intended to donate all this money for scholarships. Vikier nodded his head but mentioned that under one condition. The condition for receiving this money was that students must complete a certain number of volunteer hours at an orphanage. With a serene expression, Vensy Morg began to point at Vikyr with his finger, and asked if he wanted to give the scholarship a name, and suggested calling it the Vikyr Scholarship. Our boy wanted to remain anonymous, so he decided to call the scholarship Perry Scholarship. Upon hearing this, Dollar's eyes filled with surprise. She put her hands over her mouth and couldn't help but blush. With eyes shining with determination, Vikyr asked Vensy Morg to call the scholarship Perry Scholarship. It was already late and the sun was setting, and somewhere in the academy was the student council room. In this room were President Dollars and the others. Students had heard that this time an important scholarship sponsor had appeared. According to them, this was incredible since now one could obtain a scholarship by doing volunteer work in an orphanage. It was said that noble and powerful families were excluded from scholarships. Dollars clasped her hands and began to ponder in silence. No one knew who the anonymous donor was that had saved the lives of underprivileged students at the academy. With eyes full of curiosity, she couldn't help but wonder what Vikyr's true identity was. She began to imagine Vikyr and the others. Our boy had obtained first place in the written midterm exam, and also ranked among the top in the practical part. He was a very conscientious student, without flaws and with good relationships with his classmates. She began to remember when Vikyr was in Vensy Morgi's office. She knew that the eyes hidden behind the glasses seemed cold, but she couldn't know what was inside Vikyr. The image of Vikyr sitting with Perry came to her mind. Perry was a girl who had been sacrificed in the fight against Dantalion, and Vikyr still remembered her. She stood up and began to walk. For her it was clear that Vikyr had a warm heart hidden behind his cold exterior. Her eyes began to shine with love and she couldn't help but blush. She reached the door of Vikyr's room and remained silent. She wanted to see Vikyr and talk to him. With eyes full of nervousness, she began to bring her hand closer to the door. This feeling was one of responsibility and debt. Like someone who had seen the end of Perry together with the Nightblood Hound during the fight against Dantalion. Just then, Piggy, who was scratching his neck, opened the door, and upon seeing Dolores, his eyes filled with surprise and curiosity. Dolores and Piggy remained silent. With a confused gaze, she asked where Vikyr was. Piggy turned toward the room and with a sincere expression realized that she had come looking for Vikyr. Piggy mentioned that he didn't know where Vikyr was now, since he always wandered at night. Upon hearing this, something caught Dolores' attention and her eyes began to shine with surprise. Piggy started touching his head, closed his eyes, and with a nervous expression admitted that the room was empty. The lower part belonged to Vikyr. But he couldn't have much luggage there. It was as if he were someone who could leave at any moment. Dolores' eyes began to shine with curiosity. Piggy turned his head and with a sincere expression admitted that Vikyr seemed to have some and, as a roommate, he was worried that he would leave. Once Piggy turned around, his eyes widened in confusion. Dolores left the room, turned her back on him and began to walk away. Piggy started touching his head and his eyes filled with confusion, while the sunlight was illuminating the hallway. Dolores began walking away and she couldn't help but wonder if Vikyr was the Nightblood Hound. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the 7th elite corpse called Decorabia, in the form of a shining eye, and was an inorganic type demon. He was also one of the 10 elite corpses whose true identity had been revealed before Vikyr returned in time. This creature had existed as an artifact inside the treasure warehouse used by the Academy, and later on it was awakened by the demons, becoming a great source of power for them during the era of destruction. Vikyr clenched his fists and with a serious gaze began to look at the ground and sank into his thoughts. He was very lucky to have found the opportunity to cut off the root and would be able to avoid a future calamity. His eyes began to shine with determination. He decided to enter among the top 10, access the treasure warehouse and destroy Decorabia. Vikyr returned to the train car where the others were and grabbed the doorknob. Slowly he opened the door and began to walk inside, and instead of mocking him, Granule began to look down in silence. He threw the bottle to the ground, lowered his head before Vikyr, and began to babble. His face was pale, and he was drooling. Granule began to shake his head from side to side like a madman. Vakar entered the train car and began to observe him with a serene gaze and then nodded his head. Upon seeing this, the eyes of the Baskerville triplets began to shine with joy and a smile spread across their faces. They turned towards Vakar and gave him a thumbs up. It was daytime and the train was passing over a bridge. Vakar felt relieved since he had now eliminated a variable that could interfere with his plan. Several hours later, the train stopped, raising dust. The students got off the train and with a smile began to chat with their friends. Vakar and the Baskerville triplets also got off the train. While our boy was thinking in silence, the triplets began to stretch their arms due to tiredness. Not long after, Granule also got off the train with an exhausted gaze. Vakar's eyes began to shine with joy as something caught his attention. It was already evening and they were in the beautiful city of Dortsmile, which was located in the southeast of the empire. In the middle of the city there was a tower. Vakar's attention was fixed on the tower. That structure, narrow and tall, was the magic tower, wrapped in a spatial magic that not even modern wizards could interpret. He began to imagine Andromalia's ring, and couldn't help but wonder if the tower had the same powers as the ring. The shiny purple ring had the ability to create a barrier. Several men holding flags of the empire appeared. With a cheerful expression, a green-haired man extended his hand, and with a smile mentioned that it had been a long time. This year he had reunited with the students again as representatives of their academies. His attention was fixed on Dolores. While her eyes were shining with determination, she placed her hands over her abdomen and began to show a smile. She was the representative of the Colosseum Academy. Geraggio, a man who wore wolf skin on his head, crossed his arms and his eyes began to shine with excitement. He was the representative of Boot Camp Varangian. A brown-haired woman put her hand on her waist and began to show a smile. She was Lovegood, representative of the Themyscira Women's University. Dolores approached them and with a smile asked how everyone was. Lovegood, who had her hand on her waist, turned toward her and with a smile mentioned that in her opinion they looked the same as last time. Geraggio, who had his arms crossed, mentioned that it had been a little less than a year. The green-haired man extended his hand and revealed that 11 months, 3 days, 11 hours, 43 minutes, and 12 seconds had passed. Geraggio's eyes began to shine with joy and he couldn't help but smile since he remembered that his name was Proud and Cunning. For him his name was still funny. Proud and Cunning began to touch his glasses, and with a serious gaze mentioned that his name was hard to understand for a brain full of muscles. He was the representative of the Magic Tower. Bianca's attention was fixed on them and her eyes filled with confusion. She could not believe that his name was Proud and Cunning. With an expression full of fear and disappointment, Sinclair explained that in the Magic Tower there existed a tradition where the elders gave baptismal nicknames to the younger ones. She continued recounting that, when they wanted to call him Little Soft Cotton, he had said he would give up entering the Magic Tower. According to her, his real name should be something like Hohenheim. With a confused expression, Proud and Cunning stuck his finger inside his ear and started looking to one side. His real name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, but Proud and Cunning sounded better. Piggy, who was reading a book, approached them, and with a surprised expression commented that the representatives from each school who were there were all strong enough not to be underestimated. Upon hearing his voice, Bianca's and Sinclair's attention turned to Piggy and their eyes widened with curiosity. While Geraggio's eyes were shining with excitement, he began to show a smile. It was said that Geraggio, the representative of the Varangian boot camp, when he was in his first year, had knocked out all the fourth-year students and had taken control of the academy. There was also a rumor that his grandparents were a barbarian tribe who lived in the mountains of Adeka and Hek. Philippus began to show a calm smile. The representative of the Magic Tower had never lost even once against President Dollars during the entire University League. It was said that he had so much talent that, after graduating, he would automatically be appointed as a professor at the Magic Tower and aimed to become the youngest master of the tower. Lovegood, who had her hands on her waist, began to stare at everyone else. The representative of the Mizera Women's University not only stood out for her skill, but also for her charisma in dominating people. Therefore she was called the Peak of the Mizera. In addition, She was active as a dancer in a famous theater company. With a curious look, Piggy began to read the contents of the book. According to what he read, probably in this tournament, Philippus Hohenheim and Giraggio would compete for first and second place, while President Dollars would be in third place. The book also suggested that in fourth place would be Lovegood from the Misera. Sinclair began to observe Piggy in silence, not knowing what to say. With a confused gaze, Bianca asked where Piggy had gotten all this information. Just then, someone extended their hand. It was Philippus Hohenheim. While the sun was shining, he put one hand on his waist, and with a confident gaze realized that it had been very difficult for them to reach the magic tower, so he decided to take them directly to their accommodations. Several hours later, night fell and the sky was full of stars. Sinclair, Bianca, Piggy, Sancho, and Tudor arrived at the accommodation. They lifted their heads and their eyes widened with surprise and joy. In front of them there was a beautiful mushroom-shaped lodging. They couldn't believe that this was the place where they were going to stay. Not long after, the cooks of the magic tower prepared delicious dishes of meat, fish, and desserts. Tudor changed his clothes, grabbed the fork and knife, and upon seeing so much delicious food, his mouth watered. He couldn't help but smile since the buffet at the lodging was better than he expected. Piggy, who was sitting next to Sinclair, started turning his head from side to side with a confused gaze. He asked if anyone had seen Vicar since he was starting to get worried. With a serious gaze, Bianca began to point at the table where Vicar was. Tudor put the fork on the table and asked Piggy to stop worrying about Vicar and advised him to worry about himself. The students were eating quietly. Each academy had brought 21st-year students, 32nd year and 53rd year, which added up to a total of 100 per school. Of the 400 participants in total, only the top 10 would have the opportunity to obtain an artifact. Bianca, who had her head resting on her hand, began to look sideways with a furious gaze, seeing her expression. Tudor's attention focused on her, leaving him somewhat confused. When one of the students went for some food, he saw that there was nothing left since a man from Boot Camp Varangian put all the food on his plate and walked away with a smile. The plates of the students from the Varangian boot camp were full of food. Bianca's attention was fixed on them. She was furious because they had to share lodging with the Varangians, and she didn't like their lack of manners. With an enthusiastic smile, they got ready to fill their plates again and pushed aside the other students since, according to them, in meals, what mattered was rotation, and that meat should keep coming without stopping. They claimed that the key was in the first 5 minutes, because if you let those pass, you wouldn't eat much, and for them, quantity mattered more than quality. The girl shot off to one side, but just before she could fall to the ground, Sancho appeared and grabbed her by the shoulder. With a grateful gaze, she thanked him. While the students from the Varangian boot camp were distracted, Sancho called their attention and mentioned that if they ate everything there would be nothing left for others to eat. Upon hearing his voice, their eyes widened with curiosity and they turned around. With a serious gaze, Sancho extended his hand and mentioned that they were cutting the line, revealing that they were bothering everyone. Upon hearing this, Tudor's and Piggy's eyes widened in surprise and their jaws dropped in shock. The man with the ponytail began to point at Sancho with the kitchen tongues, started staring at him intently and asked where the line was at the buffet, and also why the students from Colosio Academy were making such a fuss. The girl hid behind Sancho and instead of feeling fear, he began to show a calm expression. Sancho began to get angry. He was afraid of losing muscle mass if he got mad, so he had tried to ignore them. But he knew this was not going to work. The man's eyes began to shine with rage. He clenched his teeth when he saw that he looked like Sancho. He had not been able to recognize him because he was wearing the academy uniform. He mocked Sancho by calling him a coward for having fled after finishing the entrance exam to Varangian. Using his hand, Sancho pushed aside the kitchen tongues, let out a sigh, and revealed that the reason why he had not gone to Varangian was because he had obtained first place in Varangian, but fifth place in Colosio Academy. He thought there was more to learn at Colosio Academy. He crossed his arms and with a serious gaze asked who he was. The man's eyes filled with rage. He clenched his fist and introduced himself as Balasan, whom Sancho had met during the exam. With a mocking gaze, Tutor put his hand over his mouth and mentioned that it was impossible for Sancho to remember someone like Balasan. With a smile, Bianca extended her hand and mentioned that the first place of the Varangian entrance exam had much to learn in Coliseo. Sancho closed his eyes and with a smile asked everyone to stop making fun of the weak. Upon hearing this, Balasan crushed the kitchen tongues with an angry expression. He said that he was the leader of Varangian's first year Boli Balasan, and challenged the first-year students of Coliseo Academy to a duel. He began to point at Sancho with his finger, and asked him to call his best warrior Sancho, and the others remained silent. With a curious gaze, they began to think in silence. Not far from them was Vikar sitting and eating. Everyone's attention was fixed on him. They began to observe our boy in silence. Balasan felt somewhat confused. While Vikar was eating calmly, Balasan approached him and slammed the table hard. Instead of panicking, our boy remained calm. With eyes shining with rage, Balasan asked if Vikar was the strongest among the first years. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. Balasan had destroyed Vikar's food. He was furious since just when he had finished cutting everything up, this guy had ruined it all. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, somewhere in the Empire was the train station full of people. It was a Twango station, and on platform number 999 was Bianca, who wore a summer dress and a hat, while on her shoulder she had her purse. With the other hand she was holding her carry-on luggage. She couldn't help but blush and smile since it had been a long time since the last time she had left the academy. Behind her were Sancho, Tutor, Sinclair and Piggy, who wore the academy uniform. With a confused expression, Tutor mentioned that if someone saw them they would think they were going on a trip to some tourist place. He asked Bianca not to forget that they were going to fight. With a serene gaze, she said that then at least they should be somewhat tense. Then she began pointing to one side with her finger. About far from them was a group of students chatting among themselves. Bianca began to point at them with her finger, and while her eyes were shining with confidence, with a smile she made it clear that anyway, in this Olympic survival competition, their Coliseo Academy was going to be the best again. The Olympic survival competition had begun. It was a tournament where the four most prestigious academies of the Empire gathered. The first was the Elite Academy, the Coliseo Academy recognized for offering the best education in all disciplines. Then there was Boot Camp Varangian, a training center for warriors specialized in melee weapons such as swords, spears, axes, and bows. An academy identical to the Coliseo Academy in structure. An educational system would also participate but composed only of women, called the Mizera Women's University. Lastly, there was the host of this edition, an Eastern Academy that brought together those who followed the path of magic, known as the Wizard Training Institute, or Magic Tower. Tutor's attention was fixed on Bianca, and with a curious gaze he asked if this time the headquarters was the Magic Tower. Bianca turned to him, and with a calm expression nodded her head and revealed that the headquarters was in Dorsmile, in the southeast of the continent. Where the Magic Tower was located, it was famous as a resting place. While they were walking through the station, the loudspeaker began to sound, revealing that the Continental Circuit train was entering the station. The next station was Huangdo, imperial capital, Huangdo Station. They approached the train tracks and began to contemplate the train. The eyes of Sancho, Bianca, and Sinclair began to shine with joy, while on the other hand, Tutor's and Piggy's jaws dropped in surprise and astonishment. The train arrived at high speed, it was releasing blue smoke, and in front of it there was a powerful magic circle. The train stopped at the station. Piggy clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with excitement, since it was the first time he was going to take a magic train. Sancho rested his hands on his waist and with a confident smile mentioned that he had already taken this train once when he had come to enroll. While Piggy was observing the train with amazement, Bianca started pointing at them with her finger and asked them not to make a silly face. Upon hearing this, everyone's attention turned to her and their eyes widened in confusion. With a confident gaze, Bianca began to show a finger and revealed that on this train were also the students from the Varangian Academy and from the Mizera Women's University who had already boarded at the previous station. According to her, they could not allow their rivals to underestimate them. While they were talking, several students got off the train. Among them was a man who had a scar on his face and a woman. Piggy's attention and that of the others focused on them. Not long after, the students from Varangian Academy, with serious expressions, began to get off the train. And then, with a smile, the girls from the Masira Women's University also got off the train. Everyone went to the station store to buy some food. Piggy's eyes widened in surprise, as he was surprised to see that suddenly everyone had gotten off the train. Tudor, who had his arms crossed, began to observe them and with a serious expression noticed that the atmosphere was quite tense upon noticing that everyone had gotten off to shop at the store. Tudor extended his hand to one side and with a confident smile mentioned that the students of Boot Camp Varangian must be grinding their teeth at seeing Sancho. With a confused gaze, Piggy extended his hands and asked why they would be grinding their teeth at seeing Sancho. Sancho, who was standing next to him, began to show a smile and his eyes started shining. Tudor closed his eyes and with a smile revealed that Sancho had placed first in the entrance exam of the Varangian boot camp and then had entered the Colosio Academy. Sancho's eyes began to shine with confidence, and he couldn't help but smile since when it came to fighting, he was always ready. While they were talking, Bianca approached them and questioned if Sinclair was in serious trouble. Upon hearing this, Sinclair's attention fixed on her and her eyes widened in surprise. Bianca remembered that she had also placed first in the entrance exam of the Magic Tower, and first in the entrance exam of the Masira Women's University. Sinclair couldn't help but smile and blush like a tomato. They got on the train. Being in first place always made her nervous, since if someone did well, at least they could tie and if not, they would lose. Piggy, who was reading the train ticket, started walking down the aisle of the train. Tudor, who was behind him, extended his hand and with a smile asked her not to worry too much. Since the real aces were the third-year students, also according to the data, there were going to be 50 third-year students, 30 second-year students and 20 first-year students. Sancho and the others began to listen to Tudor in silence. With eyes shining with calmness, Tudor began imagining various magical objects. Among them there was a book, a sword, a dagger and a necklace. He remembered that it was said that if they managed to rank among the top 10 in this competition, they could choose a treasure from the warehouse, shared by all 4 academies. He decided to make sure he got at least one treasure. They arrived at their seats, left their suitcases and got ready to sit down. For Tudor it was a shame that Vicar had not come with them. Tudor sat in the seat, crossed his arms, and let out a sigh since once again Vicar had abandoned them to team up with other boys. The attention of Sancho, who was sitting next to him, focused on him. With a smile he mentioned that it was said that Vicar had a prior commitment, so it could not be helped. He liked seeing that Vicar valued his promises that made our boy seem worthy of admiration. Bianca, who had her head resting on her hands, started to gaze off to one side and remembered that Vicar's seat was in a separate car. She couldn't help but wonder if he would have problems with students from other academies. Upon hearing this, Sinclair's eyes widened in surprise. Now she was also worried about Vicar. Keggy turned around and his face filled with sweat. He couldn't help but get nervous since more than worrying about the other academies, in reality he was more concerned that that boy was with Vicar. At the same time, in the other train car, there was a boy with purple hair. With a lost gaze, the boy sat in his seat and began to look at the floor. It was Granel of Leviathan, the third son of the Rikudokam Leviathan family, one of the 7 great houses of the empire. He had grown up being praised as the greatest genius within his clan, and until now had never allowed anyone to surpass him. Under a cherry tree was Sinclair, and Granel was watching her from afar. He had ranked second in the entrance exam, and the person who had trampled on Granel was a commoner without surname or lineage named Sinclair. Granel put his hand over his chest and couldn't help but blush. It was his first defeat suffered at the hands of a low-class commoner. However, as time went by, a strange feeling began to grow in Granel's heart. With eyes shining with joy, Sinclair began to contemplate the cherry petals. That feeling had been born from the very moment he saw her for the first time. Her white hair that drew attention, her flawless skin, her large eyes like those of a deer, her delicate and harmonious nose and lips. While she was distracted, Granol and his men were looking at her with love. It was in that moment that he discovered in his heart that he loved her. Although he denied it strongly, it was an inevitable fact. He approached her, started pointing at her with his finger, called her and with a smile asked if she had found a team. With a surprised gaze, she turned around. He tried to get closer to her little by little while reproaching himself for not being able to say anything more than sharp words like commoner. Pointing at himself with his thumb, he decided to let her join his team. Upon hearing this, Sinclair's eyes began to shine with joy and she started waving at someone. With a gaze full of joy, she began to run and passed by Granel. Upon seeing this, his eyes widened in confusion and surprise. He could not help but clench his teeth tightly and feel furious. Behind them stood Vikier, lost in his thoughts. Sinclair extended her hand and with a smile began to talk with him. At the same time, in the train car where Granol was, Vikier and the Baskerville triplets were also there. Granol began to stretch his feet due to tiredness. Our boy's attention was fixed on him, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. As if Granol were at home, he rested his feet on Vikier's knees. Our boy started to gaze toward the ground, not knowing what to say. Granol began to stare at Vikier with eyes full of contempt. He didn't know why Sinclair felt attracted to Vikier. He thought the reason was that both were from the lower class. He knew that this time he had to crush Vikier completely, and for this reason he had joined his team. Vikier began to gaze silently to one side. Granol started to take out a bottle that he had under his clothes, and with a furious gaze made it clear that he was going to be the leader of the team, and asked if Vikier had any objection. With a serene gaze, Vikier mentioned that he only cared about Granol doing his role well, and also questioned why he had rested his feet on his knees. The triplets' eyes were shining with rage. They couldn't believe someone dared disrespect Vikier. Granol said that he wanted to stretch his legs but needed somewhere to rest them. He called Vikier commoner and asked if he had a problem being the footrest of a noble. The triplets clenched their teeth tightly and their eyes widened with fury. Granol asked if Vikier wanted to fight, and if he knew what the pain of being poisoned was. Granol prepared to take a sip from the bottle, began pointing at Vikier with his finger, and with a furious gaze told him not to strut in front of him from now on, since if he made a mistake, he would implant a poisonous insect in his body. With eyes shining with evil, Granol extended his hand and poison began to emerge from his hand. He again called Vikier a commoner and asked if he had understood. While the poison was emerging from his hand, Vikier began to gaze toward the ground in silence and sank into his thoughts. Our boy stood up, made Granol stop resting his feet on his knees and decided to go to the bathroom. Vikier turned his back and Granol's eyes began to shine with rage. He asked him what he was doing. With shining eyes, Vikier closed the door, put his finger near his mouth and with a penetrating gaze gave Granol the order to be quiet. With eyes shining with rage, the triplets prepared to give Granol a beating. He clenched his teeth tightly and couldn't help feeling furious and thought that Vikier was crazy. Just then, the triplets grabbed Granol by the head, making his eyes widen in fear and confusion. Poor Granol began to scream. Vikier got out of the train car and started walking. He apologized but knew he couldn't let Granol interfere. Vikier began to contemplate the landscape through the window, knowing that in this Olympic survival competition, they had to achieve results without fail. He knew that only the top 10 had the right to take an artifact from the shared treasure. With that right, he had to enter the treasure, because he had to destroy one of the artifacts that was in there. Vikier's eyes began to shine with determination. He was standing on top of a cliff and a demonic eye was staring at him intently. This artifact was the inanimate demon, the 7th elite corpse Chilbansi Decoravia. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,
placing his hands on the table, Balasan began to stare intently at Vikier and called his attention. Our boy who was sitting in front remained silent. The attention of all the students focused on them and their eyes widened with fear, realizing that there was going to be a fight. With a furious gaze, Balasan clenched his teeth and asked if Vikier was the strongest first-year student at Kalyasio Academy. Instead of panicking, our boy stayed calm and began to ponder silently. Not long after, Balasan forcefully placed his elbow on the table. He sat across from Vikir, and while his eyes were shining with hatred, suggested an arm wrestling match without mana to see how strong Vikir really was. With a lost expression, Vikir began to gaze at the ground in silence and did not say a single word. Balasan's eyes began to shine, and an arrogant smile appeared on his face upon seeing Vikir's attitude. He mocked our boy by asking if perhaps he was feeling afraid, and if so, he could admit it without problem. He would be quite impressed with the level of Kalyasio Academy if someone like him was considered the strongest. Upon hearing this, the eyes of Bianca, Piggy, Sinclair and Tudor filled with rage. They began to stare at Balasan and couldn't help but feel furious. Just then, someone decided to put an end to this. It was Dolores, with an angry expression. She placed her hands on top of the table, started staring intently at Balasan and made it clear that she wasn't going to allow conflicts between academies before the tournament. The attention of our boy fixed on her. He was somewhat confused. Everyone noticed that she was Dolores Lankovadis, the president of the student council of the Coliseum Academy. Balasan began to gaze toward the table in silence. With a serious expression, Dolores asked them to stop playing children's games and suggested going to bed early for the tournament. At that moment, a muscular man began walking toward them and caught their attention. He placed his hand on Balasan's shoulder and seeing that the energetic young people had a small conflict, he asked Dolores if she didn't think it was going to be fun. Feeling this, Balasan turned his head and his eyes widened with confusion and surprise. With eyes shining with excitement, a red-haired man began to show a smile. He was Bakira. Dolores' attention was fixed on him and her eyes widened in surprise and astonishment. She didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, on the other side, Vikar, who was sitting next to her, remained calm. He was Geragio Bakira. Seeing that even the president of the student council of boot camp Varangia had come, people became confused. Bakira placed his hands on his waist, began to observe her with a serene gaze and mentioned that Balasan had put at stake his own name and the honor of the first-year students of boot camp Varangia by proposing a duel. He asked Vikar for his opinion, reminding him that he was considered the strongest man among the first years at the academy. His eyes began to shine with joy and an excited smile appeared on his face. He wanted Vikar to accept. Vikar remained silent, not knowing what to say. Dolores began staring intently at Bakira and mentioned that she understood what he meant, but if it couldn't be done, it couldn't be done. While Bakira's eyes were shining with joy, he placed his hand on Balasan's shoulder and with a smile began to point to the side with his finger, revealing that Balasan was desperate to show his strength and also asked them to look. With a gaze full of determination, Balasan began to snort smoke from his nose, desperate to arm wrestle Vikar. Not far away were Bianca, Sancho, Tudor, Piggy and Sinclair. Their eyes were shining with rage. They could endure being insulted, but they would not allow anyone to insult their friends. Bakira revealed that they too were desperate for Vikar to show his strength. They clenched their fists and began staring at Balasan with a piercing gaze. Dolores' attention was fixed on them and her eyes filled with concern. With a nervous expression, she began to ponder in silence, knowing that if she used her authority to force them to withdraw authoritatively, it could affect the morale of the first-year students before the tournament. Nevertheless, the safety of the students was her priority. Vikar began to observe her attentively with a curious gaze. He did not know what she had in mind. Then, he raised his head and while his eyes were shining, he began to stare at Balasan in silence. Bakira put his arm around Balasan's neck and with a smile thought that Vikar was afraid of being hurt. He promised that the gain would be done with moderation. Upon hearing this, Balasan's eyes filled with fear and confusion. Vikar began to imagine Bakira from the past, remembering that Jarajio Bakira, before his regression, had been one of the great heroes of humanity's united forces. During his time at boot camp Varangia, because his grandparents were originally from Suhi, he had suffered discrimination. But despite this, he fought against fourth-year students and became a legend for having dominated the academy. In the confrontations with the Varangia boot camp, led by Bakira and with strong cohesion, he learned not to be underestimated and to earn respect. The Loris moved away from the table and began to observe Vikar in silence. Bakira, who was standing next to Balasan, remained silent, waiting for Vikar's response. Vikar began to gaze at the ground and agreed to have an arm wrestling match with Balasan. Upon hearing this, Bakira closed his eyes and couldn't help but laugh. He was so excited that he started choking Balasan, who began screaming for help. With a worried gaze, the Loris asked if Vikar was sure about this. Our boy stood up and began to ponder. Although he was going to draw some attention, if he obsessed over trivial things, he would lose the essence. He began to gaze at the ground, then started pointing at Bakira with his finger and said that he wanted to have an arm wrestling match with Bakira instead of Balasan. Upon hearing this, their eyes filled with confusion and surprise. No one knew what was happening. Balasan's eyes filled with rage. The jaws of all the students, including the Loris, dropped in surprise. They couldn't believe that Vikar wanted to have an arm wrestling match with Bakira. With eyes shining with fury, Balasan clenched his fist and made it clear that he was Vikar's opponent. Just then, Bakira put his hand forward and an excited smile spread across his face. Seeing this, Balasan felt confused and his eyes filled with fear. He didn't know what he had in mind. Vikar began to show a determined expression, and noticing this, Bakira realized that he wasn't joking. With eyes shining with excitement, Bakira rested his elbow on the table, and while his body was releasing an immense amount of mana, with a smile he decided to accept having an arm wrestle with Vikar. Our boy also rested his elbow on the table and grabbed Bakira's hand, both prepared for an arm wrestle. The Loris stood next to the table, and with a serious expression she said that the rules were simple. The result of the arm wrestle would be decided by a clear victory, defeat or surrender, with an expression full of determination. Vikar prepared to defeat Bakira. The Loris' attention was fixed on him. With a gaze full of concern, she revealed that she would stop the duel if she noticed any risk of injury. Both grabbed each other's hands tightly, and the Loris asked them to get ready. At that moment, our boy began to apply some force, and upon noticing this, Bakira's eyes filled with surprise. He didn't know what was happening. An excited smile appeared on our boy's face. The Loris gave the signal for the duel to begin, and both started applying force. Not long after, Bakira began to gain the advantage, but our boy focused since he wasn't going to lose this arm wrestling match. All the students felt excited and began cheering. One of Balasan's friends put his hand under his chin and felt confused. He thought that Vikar would lose as soon as they started, but he wondered how, with that body, he could withstand Bakira's strength. The other man's eyes filled with surprise. According to him, this was not possible. He assumed that Bagheera was not using all his strength because he was afraid of breaking Vikar's arm. With eyes shining with seriousness, Balasan clenched his fist and began shouting, asking Bagheera not to hold back. Piggy put his hands on top of his head and felt worried for Vikar. Sinclair's eyes filled with worry and surprise. She didn't know what was happening. Tudor's eyes widened in surprise. He had felt that Vikar was strong, even in the match against Neftali, but he did not expect that he could stand up to Bagheera. Sancho was in shock as he couldn't believe how strong Vikar was. With a curious gaze, Tudor began to observe closely and mentioned that if Bagheera was doing this seriously, they could really expect Vikar's victory. The arm wrestling match was intense. Bagheera clenched his teeth tightly and decided not to lose against our boy. Dollars began to watch attentively. Bagheera's hands started trembling and he clenched his teeth tightly. He couldn't believe that Vikar was so strong. His eyes widened in confusion. He had been thinking of ending this arm wrestling properly by controlling his strength, but at the moment when he had taken his hand, his thoughts had changed. He began to imagine Vikar's muscles surrounded by mana. He thought about how the load weighed through the triceps and shoulders, and the shape of the hand was designed to maximize the strength of the forearm muscles. He realized that, although he himself was ahead in the weight category, Vikar's technique was on a completely different level. He began to imagine himself dragging a mountain. He felt that, setting aside technique, it was like a rocky mountain, like trying to forcefully pull an enormous rocky mountain. With his face full of sweat and a smile, he mentioned that the way Vikar used his power seemed to him like that of a veteran who had been through everything. He found him as experienced as his own father and wondered how it was possible. He felt curious to know who Vikar really was. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. Vikar began to speak in the language of Bagheera, revealing that he was the hunting ground. Upon hearing this, Bagheera's eyes filled with fear and surprise. With shining eyes, Vikar began to stare at Bagheera, revealing that he was the hunting ground of Balak. Vikar decided to stop playing and began to use all his strength, slamming Bagheera's hand against the table. His strength was so immense that smoke began to emerge. Seeing this, Bagheera clenched his teeth tightly. Dolores put her hands over her face. She didn't know what was happening. Everyone else's eyes filled with confusion. No one could see ahead since a dust storm had suddenly appeared. Once the curtain of dust disappeared, the broken table could be seen and Vikar lying on the ground in Bagheera's standing. No one knew who had won. With a confused gaze, Bagheera began to look at his hand just before he could admit defeat. Vikar, who was sitting on the ground with a serious gaze, admitted that he had lost. Everyone started cheering for Vikar for having fought well and for having endured so long against someone as strong as Bagheera. Bagheera clenched his fist tightly, knowing that Vikar had let him win. He began to walk toward our boy. Vikar's attention focused on him, and his eyes began to shine. They both shook hands and, speaking in the language of the tribe, Bagheera admitted that Vikar was the pride of the deep forests. His eyes began to shine with joy and he swore never to forget Vikar. He grabbed Vikar's arm and raised it in the air. With a smile, Bagheera mentioned that Vikar had incredible strength for having been able to withstand his power. Our boy remained silent. Sancho's eyes began to shine with joy, and a smile spread across his face, realizing that this was a friendship between men. Tudor crossed his arms and couldn't help but smile, since according to him Bakira was great, he was a real man. Piggy clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with excitement. His heart was racing at full speed. He really wanted the day of the tournament to arrive. It was night, and with the burning passion of men, the first day before the competition was slowly coming to an end amid intense heat. And finally, the true day of the University League arrived. Inside the tower was the management office of the Magic Tower, the master of the Magic Tower. Blue Whale began stroking his beard and mentioned that it was an honor for him to have them in the tower for this year's competition. In front of him was a woman with brown hair. She was the Masira's director named Hippolyte, and a man with a scar on his face. He was general of boot camp Varangia named Basilios. Also present was Banshee Mork, deputy director of Colosseum Academy. They were all seated around a hologram. Blue Whale thanked everyone for having made their way to the Magic Tower and expressed his gratitude. Hippolyte began to point at the hologram with her finger and mentioned that the extra eye of the Magic Tower was always amazing. Basilios couldn't help but smile since he could see all the students who were inside. With a smile, Blue Whale said it was true. You could see what the 400 students were doing. In the hologram, red dots could be seen. This year's survival competition map was the enemy and the Black Mountain. Everyone began to watch closely, and somewhere was Vikir, and behind him there were monsters staring at him. Blue Whale asked if they didn't feel great curiosity about how the students would survive in this infernal map. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, it was daytime and the sun shone high in the sky. That day marked the beginning of the Survival Olympiad. The tournament would take place in the Magic Tower, a place made up of countless spaces whose height and width were impossible to measure. Inside it awaited this year's map for the survival tournament, the jungle of the Red and Black Mountain. When night fell, Sancho and the others grabbed their weapons and began to run through the jungle. Their eyes shone with determination, and each one had the assigned health points. They were aware that students from each school were summoned at random locations by teams, and the most important rule of the tournament was to survive by adapting to the relentless environment of the mountainous jungle, without letting their assigned HP shield reach zero. At that moment, a monster stomped on the ground with force to gain momentum. Noticing this, Piggy's attention fixed on it, and his eyes filled with fear and surprise. A giant monster with eyes shining with fury appeared in front of them and began to roar. Sancho and the others stopped running, and their attention was fixed on the monster. The monster clenched its fists and lunged at them. It landed on top of them and struck with all its strength, breaking the ground into pieces. Sinclair's eyes began to shine with seriousness, and using her powers, she summoned a powerful shield around them to protect from the monster's attack. Sancho, who was standing in front, grabbed his axe and started staring at the monster. He was the tank, Sinclair was the healer, Piggy was the strategist, Tudor was the DPS, and Bianca was the archer. There existed a rule that allowed participants to survive by fleeing from magical beasts of the jungle or, on the contrary, hunting them to earn points. With a serious gaze, Piggy turned to Tudor and said that they would distract the beast until the next attack. He also told Sancho that, once his shield was depleted, he should take care of escorting Sinclair and Bianca. Tudor began to observe Piggy and nodded his head. Then, Piggy turned to Bianca and Sinclair and asked them that, while he and Tudor distracted the beast, they should aim at its vital points. Sinclair, who was holding her magic staff, and Bainka began to observe Piggy and nodded their heads. The monster became enraged, clenched its fist, and began charging toward them, ready to attack again. Seeing this, Piggy and the others started running toward it and decided to set off. They were willing to defeat this beast. With a furious gaze, the beast attacked with all its strength, but Tudor jumped and dodged the attack, making its fist hit the rocks. With a worried expression, Piggy crouched down and also dodged the attack at the last second. The monster got even angrier and started hitting with all its strength, and while it was distracted, Sinclair extended her hands and applied a buff to Bainka. She stood up and began aiming at the monster with her bow, ready to shoot. Sancho stood in front of them to protect them from a possible attack. Several seconds passed, and seeing that Bainka still hadn't shot the bow, Tudor's eyes filled with confusion. Sinclair grabbed her magic staff tightly, closed her eyes and concentrated. Bainka's eyes, who was aiming at the monster with the bow, began to glow. She started to concentrate all her power on the tip of the arrow and mentioned that she was almost ready to shoot. After charging the attack, she fired. The arrow was so powerful that it pierced part of the monster's body. Not long after, it lost its life and fell to the ground. Piggy turned around and his eyes widened in surprise since the monster had been very close. Tudor, who was observing the course of the monster, couldn't help but wonder if Bainka had shot late on purpose. Bainka placed her hands on her waist and with an arrogant expression mentioned that she shouldn't have bothered saving Tudor and thought that maybe she should have shot later. Once she opened her eyes, she felt somewhat confused. The eyes of Sancho and Sinclair filled with fear and concern. They panicked and asked Tudor and Piggy to run away. Tudor and Piggy turned around and felt somewhat confused. They were not aware that a powerful burst of fire was approaching them. The burst of fire exploded, creating a great explosion in the area. The person who had summoned the burst of fire extended his hand toward them and felt furious and called the students from Colossio Academy insects. It was none other than Philippus. He extended his hand and while his body was surrounded by powerful flames, with an arrogant expression made it clear that, for him, it made no sense that they were above the magic tower in the hierarchy. Currently he had 83 HP points. The reality was that prey that could add points could also be people. Granel was walking through the jungle. He had 77 HP points. His eyes were full of exhaustion and his face full of sweat. Using his hand, he wiped the sweat. His energy vanished just by walking through the forest, and he wondered how it was possible that a hellish jungle like this existed in the real world. He also questioned where the hell the others had gone. He began to imagine Vicar and the Baskerville triplets. Granel started sweating like crazy, and his eyes widened with rage upon noticing that they had ventured so recklessly, and he couldn't help but wonder if they had already been eliminated and teleported to the waiting room. He began to remember what had happened in the train car. According to him, they were complete useless people. He thought with regret that if only he hadn't let his guard down that time, he would have put those guys in their place properly. Just then, a strange aroma began to spread through the air, and this caught Granel's attention. He couldn't help but blush and put his hand over his stomach. His mouth watered as it was the smell of food. He wiped his mouth with his hand and, with a smile, began to follow the trail of the smell. Giving off the aroma of food in the middle of the forest was like putting up a sign that said, "I'm here, come get me." Not long after, in the distance, He saw a campfire and thought he had found free food, but to his surprise, he triggered the trap that was on the ground. Upon feeling this, he looked down, and his eyes widened in fear and surprise. The rope wrapped around his foot, lifting him upside down. Granel panicked and started screaming like a madman. He didn't know who had set the trap and demanded to be brought down immediately. The person who had set the trap was an archer. They began walking toward Granel and felt somewhat confused to see that he had triggered the trap. Granel's attention fixed on them and his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. The people who had placed the trap were none other than Vikir and the triplets. Our boy had 100 HP points, while the others had 95, 96 and 97. Vikir began to gaze at the ground. The triplets put their hands on their waists and began to look at Granel with contempt. For him this was a disgrace. They deactivated the trap and brought Granel down, and then they sat around the bonfire. While the triplets were silent, Granel sat next to Vikir and began to show a forced smile. They started to prepare some meat on the bonfire. Granel's attention was fixed on the tent, and his mind was filled with surprise. There was not only food but also an improvised tent, which made him wonder who could have done all this. The triplets began to stare at him. High Burrow said that the commoner Vikir had done all this. Middle and Low Burrow nodded their heads. With a curious expression, Granel began to point at Vikir with his finger and asked if a commoner had done all this, dismissing the idea as a lie. He wondered how a nobody like Vikir could achieve something like this. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. The triplets began to stare at him, and their eyes started to shine with rage. Granel raised his hands and panicked, saying that he just wanted to know how Vikir had done all this. The smell of food began to pass under Granel's nose. He couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly and feel furious. He wondered why he, a member of the 7 great families, had to worry about the opinion of a damn commoner, and also had the feeling that those idiots from the Baskervilles were covering for him. He put his hand over his stomach and let out a sigh. Vikir and the others began to watch in silence. The triplets couldn't help but laugh at him. Noticing this, Granel felt even more furious. He was so humiliated that he wished to die. Vikir brought a piece of meat close to Granel's face and mentioned that they were roasting it to attract monsters, but if he wanted, he could eat a little since they had already eaten. His attention focused on it, and his eyes widened in surprise. His mouth watered. He began to extend his hand to grab the piece of meat and asked why Vikir was being generous with him. The eyes of our boy began to shine with malice, and a smile spread across his face when he said that he was being generous because Granel was the leader of the team. Granel felt somewhat confused. Vikir knew that Granel's poison could also be useful in the jungle and thought that he might be useful to them later. Granel closed his eyes and couldn't help but cry. He was thinking about that damn commoner. He, who had looked down on him so much, realized that Vikir was better than he had thought. He took the roasted meat and with tears in his eyes began to eat. His HP points went from 77 to 90. Vikir and the others stood watching in silent amazement. Later, someone shot an arrow at high speed, which lodged into the leg of a monster that was fleeing. The person who had shot the arrow was Vikir. Next to him was Granel, who extended his hands and with a gaze full of determination began to use his poison power. With their eyes shining with excitement, The triplets began charging at the monster. The monster with the shape of a bear and horse got enraged. It turned around and started to roar. But the triplets attacked quickly and started to cause wounds to the monster. Not long after, it lost its life and fell to the ground. Vikir revealed that they had already hunted 30 beasts. The triplets were happy since this was very easy. Vikir looked at the ground and revealed that if he wanted to secure a place within the top 10, he would have to hunt more. Granul's attention and his mind were filled with curiosity. He did not know why only Vikir hunted monsters instead of other students, since he remembered that hunting students gave more points. Vikir raised his head and sunk into his thoughts. Granul became even more curious, not knowing what he had in mind. Vikir's eyes began to shine. This felt familiar, the survival score, the score for hunting monsters, even the points obtained by making others fall behind, all of it was familiar. Even back then, he had avoided the gazes of others, caught the monster and obtained first place in the tests. That testing site also felt like home. However, his senses, enhanced after becoming a sword master and after entering the Red and Black Mountain inside the magic tower, were warning him for some reason. Vikir began to gaze toward the ground, not knowing what was happening. But he noticed that something was approaching. While they were distracted, not long after, something began to move toward them at great speed. Without losing a second, with a killer gaze, the triplets drew their swords and stood in front of Vikir. Our boy drew his bow, ready to attack. Granul, with a confused gaze, extended his hands and also prepared to fight. His eyes widened in surprise and confusion. He could not believe what his eyes were seeing. It was Sinclair, who now only had 38 HP points. Her body was full of scratches and her clothes were torn. She put her hands on her knees and with a gaze full of fear began to pant heavily. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, at the same time, in the administration room of the Magic Tower, all the professors were monitoring the students. Among them was also Vinci Morgue. According to the data shown by the system, the current state of the participants revealed that out of 400 who started, only 149 remained alive. The distribution of these survivors was as follows. The Magic Tower had 46. Boot Camp Varangia followed closely with 45. The Masira had 35 and Colosseo Academy was at the rear with only 23. The attention of the general from Boot Camp Varangia focused on the hologram of the mountain and an arrogant smile spread across his face. His satisfaction was due to Colosseo Academy's students, who were already few in number, having suffered a critical blow. Hohenhe had just eliminated their first-year students en masse. The director of the Masira, Hippolyte, began touching her chin and with a smile said that Hohenhe looked very imposing. The master of the Magic Tower, Blue Whale, began to stroke his beard, extended his hand and could not help but feel joyful upon seeing that the arrogant know-it-all Hohenhe had finally shown his true nature. According to him, the Colosseum Academy had no luck whatsoever in this tournament. Vinci Morgue began to gaze toward the ground in silence, not knowing what to say. Blue Whale's attention fixed on him, and with a curious gaze, he asked what Vinci Morgue was thinking about so deeply. With a lost gaze, Vinci Morgue began to observe the hologram in silence, sunk in his thoughts. Then he extended his hand, and while his eyes were shining with concern, he expressed the doubt that was eating away at him, feeling the weight of his responsibility as host of the survival tournament. He questioned whether others really believed that this map was safe for holding the competition. With an arrogant expression, Blue Whale questioned what he meant by that. Vinci Morg began to stare at the hologram and with a serious gaze explained that the magic tower had not modeled the tournament location as an ordinary jungle, but had based it on the deep and still unreleased zones of the jungle. This meant that not only was the terrain more hostile, but also that the summoned magical beasts became progressively more dangerous, reaching levels that students could not handle. He recalled that, according to reports sent by the Morg family years ago, in one of these unreleased zones a level S magical beast had appeared, according to estimates, an event which caused severe losses and damage. His eyes widened in fear as a terrible doubt struck him. He wondered if, in case a beast of this caliber appeared in the tournament jungle, the system of the magic tower would be able to function properly. And what was even more disturbing, he questioned whether they were truly prepared to prevent the worst catastrophe. Blue Whale began to gaze at the ground and made it clear that this had not been news, but a simple rumor, one that he too had heard. He put his hand over his face and explained that since that incident there had been no other. He emphasized that those who spread these rumors were the Morg family, who were in open opposition to his magic tower, which is why, from the beginning, he did not trust what they said. On the other hand, he stated that the beasts appearing on the tournament field were summoned adapting to the students' abilities. Currently, the level of participants ranged from basic sword expert to 4th circle mage, which was equivalent to a low-level graduator. Blue Whale began imagining Vicar with eyes shining with evil, explaining that, nevertheless, there was a condition for this to happen. If someone had 7th circle level skills or higher, in other words, at sword master level, then just as Vinci Morg feared, they could summon beasts that the system could not control. However, he insisted this was almost impossible, or more precisely, completely impossible. And in the unlikely event an accident occurred, the solution was simple: the competition would be suspended. At the same time, Tudor, Sancho, Piggy and Bianca appeared in the tournament waiting room. Tudor began to touch his head with an embarrassed expression, while on the other side, Piggy put his hands on his head and started going crazy. Blue Whale asked them not to worry, since also, if a student's HP shield reached 0, they would be automatically teleported to the tournament waiting room. Because of this, he didn't understand what problem there could be. With an arrogant expression, he began staring at Vinci Morg and questioned whether he was protesting just because there were few students from Colosseum. With a furious expression, Vinci Morg stood up and asked him to stop saying nonsense. Blue Whale turned his head to one side and made it clear that this was a place where the best mages of the empire gathered. And both the Morg family, known only for its fame, and Colosseum Academy were completely different in essence. He interlaced his hands and with a smile mentioned that it was a waste of time to worry about fantasies that wouldn't even come to happen. Upon hearing this, Vinci Morg couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly and his eyes widened with rage. He knew that it was impossible to reason with this old man. At the same time in the forest, Vicar sat in front of the bonfire, interlaced his hands and with a curious gaze asked if Tudor, Piggy, Bianca and Sancho had been eliminated. Sinclair, who was sitting in front, nodded her head. She held her magic staff tightly. And her eyes filled with sadness. She revealed that Tudor and Piggy were attacked without defense by Hohenhe from the magic tower. Just like the others, Vicar's eyes began to shine with seriousness, and the image of his opponents came to his mind. He recognized Hohenhe as one of the great heroes who stood out during the era of devastation. But he also knew that, even if they were heroes from the same era, there could still be differences in their abilities. Sinclair felt lucky to have found Vicar, but she was confused since she didn't know why his HP was intact. Our boy had 100 HP points, He began staring at her in silence. Granuel, who had his arms crossed and back leaning against the tree, was listening to their conversation. Sinclair's eyes began to shine with joy, and with a smile she admitted that she got tired quickly, losing HP just by running a little through the forest. But Wicker, on the other hand, was truly incredible. Our boy, who was lost in his thoughts, remained silent. Granuel clenched his teeth tightly, and his eyes widened with rage. He couldn't stand seeing them so close together. He knew that they were simply hiding deep in the forest hunting beasts, and because of this they maintained their good condition and their HP intact. He wondered what was so impressive about all this, convinced that he could do something like that too. Vikar's eyes filled with seriousness. He turned around and grabbed several arrows. Our boy began to aim at Granuel with the bow. Upon seeing this, Granuel panicked, raised his arms, and said he hadn't said anything wrong. Sinclair's attention focused on him, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. The reality was that a monster with tentacles was about to attack Granuel. Without wasting any more time, Wicker decided to shoot the bow. Granuel ducked down, closed his eyes, put his hands over his head and started screaming like a madman. The arrows shot out and hit the monster's tentacles. Someone who was holding a magic staff was somewhat surprised to see Vikar's instinct. Even though they had used silence magic to eliminate the sound of approaches, Wicker had still noticed. Sinclair and the others drew their weapons. Granuel stood up and began to run toward them. The student who had launched the attack belonged to the Women's University, the Messera. With an arrogant expression, she thought that the chicks from the Colosseum believed that by hiding in a place like this, she wouldn't find them. Next to her was a girl carrying a shield with 70 HP points and an archer with 81 points. She started touching her hair and with a confident gaze began to point at them with the magic staff and called them arrogant. She had 85 HP points. It was night, and one of them recognized Sinclair. Upon hearing this, her eyes widened in surprise and confusion. With a confused gaze, the archer asked her friend if she really knew Sinclair. She began to stare at Sinclair, and with a serious gaze revealed that she was the famous traitor who, despite having passed first place in the Messera's entrance exam, had ended up going to Colosseo Academy. With a nervous expression, the archer suggested to her friend not to say this in front of the president. Upon hearing this, her eyes filled with fear and worry. Lovegood Merlini could not help but feel furious and asked Sinclair how dare she had rejected the Messera, the best female academy of the empire, only to end up choosing to go to Colosseo Academy. Her eyes began to shine with arrogance when she questioned if Sinclair had gone to Colosseo Academy, a mixed academy, for such a trivial reason as romance. To top off her mockery, she wondered since when there had been handsome boys at the Colosseum. At that moment, her eyes filled with love, and she could not help but turn red like a tomato. Her attention was fixed on Vicer. She was astonished, as she could not understand how in one single face nerdiness, tenderness, sensuality and beauty could coexist. She admitted that he was totally her type. Our boy could not help but feel somewhat confused. She began to drool at the thought of Vicer. The archer and her friend felt somewhat confused upon seeing this. Just then, someone placed a hand on Vicer's face. It was Sinclair. She clenched her fist tightly, and while her eyes were shining with rage, she asked Lovegood Merlini to stop looking at Vicer. Upon hearing this, Lovegood Merlini's eyes began to shine with malice, and a murderous aura started to emerge from her body. Noticing this, her friends panicked, knowing that this was not good. She gripped her magic staff tightly, and mana began to emerge from her body. She could not believe what Sinclair had just said. She activated her powers and not long after, tentacles began to emerge from the ground. Vicer and Sinclair started watching her in silence. Lovegood Merlini's eyes began to shine with fury. She started screaming, swearing to kill Sinclair, and the tentacles she had summoned shot out toward her. Somewhere else in the forest, several explosions occurred. They had been caused by Hohenhe, who currently had 83 HP points, with an arrogant smile. He asked his opponents to stop running and surrender at once, since there was nothing a healer could do alone without any combatant. He was facing Dollars, who clenched her teeth tightly, and with an expression full of determination extended her hands and summoned a barrier to protect herself from the attack. The flames of Hohenhe fell behind her, and when she turned around, her eyes widened in surprise and fear upon seeing that she was surrounded. Hohenhe began to walk toward her and made it clear that she no longer had anywhere to run. His eyes began to shine with malice and, with a smile, he assured that if she fell, her academy would no longer have any chance. With this, the survival competition would be a victory for the Magic Tower. Dollars began to pant heavily but decided not to give up. She knew she couldn't fall here. At that moment, someone wielding a sword emerged and prepared to attack. The attention of Dollars and Hohenhe focused on them, leaving them somewhat confused. It was Bakira, with his body surrounded by mana and his eyes shining with excitement. He asked Hohenhe not to be so confident. Bakira swung the sword forcefully and attacked. Luckily, Hohenhe reacted in time and by summoning a barrier, blocked the attack. He couldn't help but grit his teeth, realizing that Bakira was a graduate. Bakira's eyes began to shine with joy. With a smile he noticed that Hohenhe had reached, knowing that he couldn't fall behind. He attacked again using all his strength, and his sword struck against Hohenhe's barrier. At the same time, the tentacles that Lovegood Merlini had summoned began to advance rapidly toward Vikir. Just then, with their eyes shining, the Baskerville triplets cut the tentacles into pieces. Vikir prepared to shoot the bow, realizing that this magic was similar to what the 3 flowers of Morgue used. However, this was a combination of 3 different. He understood that it required an extremely high level of concentration, and even so, his opponent managed to use it with admirable skill, even while under the influence of intense emotions. His eyes widened in fear as he began to feel a strange mana. With a gaze full of fear, Vikir turned around. Crows began to fly through the forest, and Vikir couldn't help but wonder what this strange energy was. The ground began to shake, and not long after, it started to crack. Hohenhe was confused without knowing what was happening. Bakura began to gaze toward the ground and mentioned that he had never heard there could be earthquakes in the deep forests. At that moment, something emerged from the ground, everyone's attention fixed on it, leaving them in shock. Their eyes widened with fear and surprise. They didn't know what was happening. The attention of Vikir and Sinclair also fixed on it. They were somewhat confused. A giant spider emerged from the ground. Vikir's eyes widened in surprise. A spider opened its mouth and began to roar. She was Madam of 8 Legs. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the spider madam opened its mouth and with eyes shining with rage, decided to attack. The Baskerville triplets began to move at great speed. Dodging the attacks, Vikir remained calm. Sinclair grabbed her magic staff with both hands and could not help but feel fear, while on the other side, Granville panicked. Lovegood Merlini was staring silently at Madam. Her eyes were full of fear. She did not know what this creature was. Seeing her expression, her friends panicked and asked her to react, insisting that they should flee immediately. While Vicar was fleeing the area along with the others, his gaze fixed on Madam and his eyes began to shine with seriousness, realizing that she was the cause of the unease he had felt since the moment he entered the tournament field. Vicar began to imagine a book, remembering that before regressing, the stories about Madam were nothing more than legends passed down as horror tales. It was only after multiple investigations that she was finally recorded in the imperial bestiary as an official magical beast, which meant that until then, there had been no reliable testimony from anyone who had seen her clearly. Even within the magic tower where the tournament was held, there were no precedents. He understood that this must be another variable caused by his return. All Madam's eyes were shining with malice. Vicar began to stare at it in silence. It attacked using one of its legs, and as the leg slowly approached, Lovegood Merlini became paralyzed with fear. Not knowing what to do, meanwhile on the other side, her friends drew their weapons ready to fight. Her eyes were full of terror. She couldn't move and couldn't believe she was going to be eliminated without being able to do anything about it just before the attack could hit her. Her team's tank, her friend, stood in front and used her shield to block the attack. But the difference in strength was too great, so she turned toward her with a worried gaze and asked her to step aside. Upon hearing her voice, Lovegood Merlini came out of her thoughts and her eyes widened in surprise. Luckily, she reacted in time and moved out of the path of the attack, causing Madam's leg to pass by her at great speed, destroying everything in its path. Once Lovegood Merlini turned around, her eyes widened in fear, leaving her in shock. Madam's attack was so powerful that it made Anna, her friend, crash into a tree. Her shield was broken and lying on the ground, and she was unconscious. Madam began to observe closely, and its mouth watered. Then the beast's eyes began to shine with excitement. Thanks to its sharp senses, it was able to detect the body heat of the other students who were in the forest. Without wasting any more time, it started charging towards them, passing by Vicar and the others. Randall fell on his butt to the ground, and his mind filled with surprise and confusion. He couldn't believe that it had gone somewhere else. He had thought he was going to be eliminated. Vicar, who was standing up, clenched his fist and began to observe Madam in silence. Our boy couldn't help but wonder if it was heading towards where more students were gathered. His eyes began to shine with concern. He couldn't help but wonder what the administration room was doing at this moment. He knew they shouldn't allow an entity outside of parameters to participate in the tournament. Vicar's thoughts were interrupted by Lovegood Merlini, who started running toward Anna to see if she was okay. Vicar turned toward them and became somewhat curious. Anna was injured, her body full of scratches, and her HP had dropped to 0. Lovegood Merlini's eyes widened in confusion and surprise. She couldn't understand why Anna hadn't been teleported to the waiting room if her HP was clearly at 0. The friend's eyes filled with fear. She couldn't help but panic since she didn't know how they were going to get out of this place now. She put her hand over her mouth and couldn't help but cry. While on the other side, Lovegood Merlini fell to her knees and began to gaze at the ground in silence, not knowing what to do now. With a confused expression, Randall began to walk toward them, extended his hand and asked what was going on, since it was supposed that even if they were eliminated, they should be returned to the waiting room. He put his hand on top of his head and started to go crazy. According to him, this made no sense. If a beast had appeared that did not meet the standards, He didn't understand why the tournament wasn't even showing signs of being suspended and wondered what the administration room was doing at that moment. Biker began to ponder in silence. Randall put his hands on top of his head, fell to his knees on the ground and went into panic. His eyes widened with fear at the thought that they had been abandoned. He came to the conclusion that the administration couldn't even handle the situation and had simply left them behind. Biker kept calm, drew his bow and asked him to calm down. Instead of calming down, Randall started screaming like a madman. He didn't want to die in this place. At the same time, someone made their way through the bushes and saw them. It was Dolus, Bakira and Hohenhe. Bakira, who had his sword resting on his shoulder, began to observe our boy in silence, while on the other side, Hohenhe began to show a calm gaze. Dolus' eyes widened with worry. She didn't know if they were okay. At the same time, in the administration room of the Magic Tower, the hologram turned red, Blue Whale, and the others panicked upon realizing that although the students' HP points had reached 0, they were not being teleported back. Now that one was injured, they decided it was better to get them out immediately. With a gaze full of concern, Vince Morg began to shout and ask Blue Whale to stop the tournament. Blue Whale's eyes widened with fear and confusion. He couldn't believe that a beast like Madam was in the forest and began to wonder if everything the Morg family had said was true. He began to gaze toward the ground with a confident expression, knowing that if the spider hadn't appeared, the Magic Tower could have won the tournament. Upon hearing this, Vince Morg couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly, without wasting any more time. He got up from his seat and started running. With an angry expression, he grabbed Blue Whale by the collar and asked him to stop the tournament immediately, asking him if he wanted everyone there to die. Upon seeing Vince Morg's attitude, Blue Whale couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. With a sincere gaze, he revealed that this was not possible. Even if they tried to stop the tournament, it would not stop. Upon hearing this, Vince Morg began to stare at Blue Whale with a furious gaze. Blue Whale remained calm, explaining that an entity that even the Magic Tower had difficulty controlling had been summoned, causing an overload in the system and the loss of its control. Noticing that they could not enter nor could the students leave, with a worried expression. Vince Morg asked if there was any way to solve this. Blue Whale began to move his finger and started to point at a bright spot on the hologram. He began to imagine Madam with shining eyes and revealed that if this creature was eliminated in the tournament field, the Magic Tower system would return to normal. At the same time in the forest, Dollars sat next to Anna, who was injured, and using her powers she began to heal her. Luckily, as the HP shield was consumed, the impact had been slightly mitigated. Her eyes began to shine with tranquility. She turned towards Lovegood Merlini and explained that Anna was only unconscious for a moment, and if she rested well, she would be fine. Lovegood Merlini sat down beside, rested her hands on her knees and began to gaze at the ground with a lost look. She felt relieved to see that the situation here had somehow been controlled, but her concern immediately focused on the place Madam was now heading to. While Madam was attacking the other students, Dollar's attention was fixed on it. She hoped that the other students had not suffered harm. While she was trying to understand what was happening, Wicker, who was standing behind, began to ponder in silence. He began to look at the ground and his eyes filled with guilt, remembered that the monster Madam of 8 legs had a danger classification level S, a calamity of the type annihilation of nations whose mere existence was enough to break the wilt alive. He knew that this madam was not the same as the one he had met outside the magic tower. She did not use her poison, and all her multiple eyes had disappeared, which meant she now had blind spots. Her body, once impenetrable, showed holes in several parts. He suspected that she had been summoned to the tower with a distortion between the madam of the past and the already dead one, as if she existed in an altered state of reality. Biker raised his head and his attention focused on someone. In front of him was Lovegood Merlini sitting and silently looking at the ground. Bakira and Hohenhe remained silent, not knowing what to do. Our boy clenched his fist tightly. He was aware that even though they could recognize those differences, there was no possibility whatsoever that they could defeat even a weakened madam. He knew they first needed to recover their will that had been crushed by fear. To avoid further losses and fulfill their objective, he had no choice but to use his power. Just at that moment, someone decided to go confront madam. Upon hearing this, our boy came out of his trance and his eyes widened in surprise. Lovegood Merlini grabbed her magic staff and began to stand up. She knew she couldn't stay here, sunk in despair. Because of her complacency, one of her companions had almost lost their life and she was going to take revenge. Besides, she wanted to protect those who were still left and wasn't going to allow anyone else to get hurt. Her eyes began to shine with determination, making it clear that she was the president of the student council of the Masira. Someone forcefully drove their sword into the ground and mentioned that Lovegood Merlini's determination fit better with the students of boot camp Varangia. It was Bakira. With a confident smile he decided to help her face madam. With a worried gaze, Dollars approached her and also decided to help. She knew better than anyone that they couldn't sacrifice the students in this place. Lovegood Merlini turned around and began to ponder in silence. Not far from them stood Hohenhe. Everyone's attention was fixed on him, not knowing if he would also help them. Bakira was honest, although he hated to admit it. He knew they needed Hohenhe's strength. Upon hearing this, a smile spread across Hohenhe's face. Under the moonlight, he adjusted his glasses and with a confident gaze mentioned that, although it bothered him, he would accept a temporary alliance just this once. It was all for the victory of the magic tower. Biker began to observe them closely. He had underestimated them, remembering that even during the era of destruction, they were the great heroes who stood at the front more than anyone else. A smile spread across his face. Biker caught the attention of the triplets, making their eyes widen with curiosity. With a calm expression, Vicar began to ponder. His eyes started to shine with seriousness when he gave them the order that from this moment on, they would be in charge of transmitting his message to others about how to defeat Madam Eightlegs. At the same time, Madam was chasing the students, who were running for their lives. Their eyes were full of fear and despair. One of the students tripped and fell face first to the ground. Noticing this, her friend panicked. With eyes full of fear and tears, she reached out her hand toward her friend, revealing that she had twisted her ankle and asking for help. Upon hearing this, the friend swallowed hard. He didn't know what to do now. Without hesitating even a second, he turned his back on his friend, closed his eyes and started running for his life, asking for forgiveness. With eyes shining with evilness, Madam began to extend its legs toward the girl, ready to attack her. The girl's eyes filled with tears, knowing that this was not good. Just before Madam could attack, Someone attacked with a fire spell, saving the girl by a hair. The explosion created a curtain of smoke. Madam's eyes began to glow, and when the curtain of smoke disappeared, it could be seen that it was intact. The one who had cast the fire spell was Hohenhe. He began to stare at it and started to cast another spell, realizing that his fire magic had done no damage to it, even though insect monsters should be very vulnerable to it. Fire began to emerge from his magic staff, and his eyes began to shine with excitement. Behind Hohenhe appeared Dolus, Sinclair, and Granuel, ready to face the fearsome madam. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,